The stage lights went dark at Folsom State Prison on January 13th, 1968. Johnny Cash stood in the prison cafeteria, guitar in hand, sweat dripping down his face despite the January cold. 2,000 inmates had just experienced something they'd never forget. But Johnny didn't know that in 7 years, one moment from this concert would change his life forever. His name was Glen Sherley, inmate number 59,437. He sat in the third row that day, a man who'd spent most of his adult life behind bars. Armed robbery, assault, a string of bad decisions that led him to one of America's most notorious prisons. But Glen had a secret. Late at night, in his cell, he wrote songs, poetry set to melodies only he could hear, scribbled on whatever paper he could find. One of those songs was called Greystone Chapel. It was about the prison chapel at Folsom, a place where men who'd done terrible things went looking for redemption. Glen had poured his soul into those lyrics, every word bleeding with the desperation of a man who knew he might die in prison. A few weeks before the concert, Glen's nephew worked as a correctional officer. Glen handed him a piece of paper through the bars. "Can you get this to Johnny Cash?" he asked. "I know it's crazy, but maybe, just maybe." The nephew did more than that. He drove to Cash's house and hand-delivered the song. Johnny Cash read those lyrics in his living room. His hands shook. He'd struggled with addiction, spent nights in jail himself, knew what it felt like to be trapped by your own choices. This wasn't just a song. It was a prayer written by a man the world had given up on. Cash did something unprecedented. He learned the song, rehearsed it, and on that January morning in 1968, he walked into Folsom Prison with one goal beyond giving a concert. He was going to perform Glen Sherley's song, Live, without telling him first. The recording equipment was rolling. Columbia Records was there. This would become one of the most famous live albums in history. But Johnny Cash wasn't thinking about record sales when he stepped up to the microphone after several songs and said, "I'd like to do a song that was written by a man right here in Folsom Prison." Glen Sherley's heart stopped. Inmates around him turned to stare. Did Cash just say what they thought he said? "His name is Glen Sherley," Johnny continued. The entire cafeteria erupted, 2,000 inmates screaming, whistling, pounding on tables. Glen sat frozen, tears streaming down his face, as Johnny Cash sang his song to the world. That performance changed Glen's life. The publicity helped him get parole. He walked out of Folsom Prison in 1971, 3 years after that concert. Johnny Cash hired him immediately. Glen Sherley, ex-convict, became a member of Johnny Cash's road crew and occasional performer. But this isn't a simple redemption story. This is a story about the crushing weight of second chances and the moment when two men's lives intersected again in the most unexpected way. Fast forward to December 1974. Glen had been free for 3 years. He'd toured with Cash, performed on stage, even recorded an album. But freedom wasn't what he'd imagined. The world outside prison was harder to navigate than the world inside. He struggled with the transition, with staying clean, with feeling like he belonged anywhere. The spotlight that saved him also burned him. People wanted the reformed convict story, but they didn't know what to do with the complicated reality of a man still fighting his demons. The relationship with Cash became strained. Glen felt like a charity case. Johnny felt the weight of responsibility for a man whose problems ran deeper than a good job could fix. By late 1974, Glen was no longer working for Cash. He was drifting, trying to make it as a musician on his own, battling the same addiction and anger issues that had put him in prison in the first place. On December 7th, 1974, Johnny Cash performed at the Anaheim Convention Center in California. 15,000 people packed the venue. It was a massive show, part of Cash's winter tour. The Man in Black was at the peak of his fame. His television show was a hit. His marriage to June Carter was solid. He was clean, focused, powerful. Glen Sherley bought a ticket. He sat in the upper section, far from the stage, just another face in the crowd. He hadn't spoken to Cash in months. He didn't have a backstage pass. He was just a former inmate who once had 15 minutes of fame, now struggling to pay rent and stay out of trouble. The concert was electric. Johnny performed all the hits: Folsom Prison Blues, Ring of Fire, I Walk the Line. The crowd was on their feet, singing along, completely absorbed in the moment. Glen watched from his seat, hands gripping the armrests, a storm of emotions tearing through him: pride, shame, gratitude, resentment, love, loss. Then Johnny did something unexpected. Between songs, he started talking about Folsom Prison, about the men he'd met there, about redemption and second chances, about a song written by an inmate that had touched his heart. "I want to tell you about a man named Glen Sherley," Johnny said into the microphone. His voice was gentle, but carried to every corner of that massive convention center. Glen's breath caught in his throat. 15,000 people went silent, listening. "Glen wrote a song called Greystone Chapel while he was serving time at Folsom," Johnny continued. "I performed it at that prison concert, and it became part of something bigger than any of us expected. Glen got out. He came to work with us. And I want him to know, wherever he is tonight, that his song mattered, that his life matters, that his story isn't over." Glen was weeping openly now. People around him were starting to notice. Johnny Cash was talking about him, to him, for him, in front of 15,000 people. But Johnny wasn't done. "Glen, if you're out there, if you can hear me, I want you to know something." His voice cracked slightly. Johnny Cash, the man in black who'd faced down prison crowds and addiction and fame, was getting emotional on stage. "I failed you, brother. I wanted to save you with a job and a stage, but I didn't understand that salvation doesn't work that way. You're fighting a battle I know too well, and I should have fought it alongside you instead of expecting you to have all the answers just because you walked out of those prison gates." The arena was absolutely silent, except for Johnny's voice. June Carter stood at the side of the stage, tears streaming down her face. The band members looked at each other, unsure what was happening, but understanding they were witnessing something profound. "This next song is for Glen Sherley," Johnny said, "and for every man and woman fighting to stay free, whether from prison bars or the bars we build in our own minds." He started playing Greystone Chapel, the song Glen had written in a prison cell, the song that had changed both their lives. Glen couldn't take it anymore. He stood up. People around him parted like water. He started walking down the aisle toward the stage. Security moved to stop him, but something in his face, in the way he moved with tears streaming down his cheeks, made them pause. Johnny was halfway through the song when he saw the commotion. A man walking down the center aisle, security following at a distance. The spotlight operator, following Johnny's gaze, swung the light toward the approaching figure. Johnny recognized him immediately. He stopped singing. The band continued for a few more measures before trailing off into confused silence. "Glen," Johnny said into the microphone, his voice barely above a whisper. Glen reached the front of the stage. He looked up at the man who'd given him a second chance, who'd sung his song to the world, who'd just apologized to him in front of 15,000 people. "I'm here, Johnny," Glen said. His voice couldn't reach the microphone, but Johnny heard him. June heard him. The people in the first rows heard him. What happened next has been told and retold for decades, but those who were there say no retelling captures the raw emotion of that moment. Johnny Cash dropped to his knees at the edge of the stage. His guitar swung behind him. He reached down, and Glen reached up, and their hands clasped together. Johnny pulled Glen up onto the stage. It wasn't graceful. It was desperate and real and beautiful. They embraced, two men who'd both been broken, both been saved, both been lost again. Johnny Cash held Glen Sherley like a brother, and 15,000 people watched in absolute silence as both men wept. Then the silence broke. The entire convention center erupted. Standing ovation doesn't describe it. People were screaming, crying, hugging strangers next to them. The band members were wiping their eyes. June Carter walked over and put her arms around both men. Johnny handed Glen his guitar. Glen looked at it like it was a foreign object, like he'd forgotten how to hold it. But Johnny nodded, and Glen's fingers found the strings, and together they finished Greystone Chapel. Glen sang the words he'd written in a prison cell, words about finding God in a place where hope went to die, and Johnny Cash harmonized with him, and 15,000 people bore witness to redemption in real time. When the song ended, Johnny kept Glen on stage. They performed 3 more songs together. Glen's voice was rough, unpracticed, but it was honest. It was real. And in that moment, he wasn't an ex-convict or a failed musician or a burden. He was exactly where he belonged. After the concert, Johnny and Glen talked for hours backstage. They didn't fix everything that night. Glen's struggles didn't magically disappear, but they rebuilt something that had broken. They became brothers again, not employer and employee, not savior and saved, but 2 men fighting the same demons with different weapons. Glen Sherley's story doesn't have a perfect ending. Life rarely does. He struggled with addiction and depression for years. In 1978, 4 years after that reunion concert, Glen took his own life. He was 42 years old. The weight of trying to live up to a redemption story proved too heavy to carry. But here's what matters. That night in Anaheim, December 7th, 1974, Glen Sherley stood on stage with Johnny Cash in front of 15,000 people and felt for one more moment that his life had meaning, that his song mattered, that he wasn't alone. Johnny Cash never forgot Glen Sherley. He performed Greystone Chapel for the rest of his career. He talked about Glen in interviews, kept his memory alive, used his story to advocate for prison reform and mental health services. The Folsom Prison concert album with Glen's song sold millions of copies and continues to inspire people today. Glen Sherley wrote that song in the darkest place imaginable, never dreaming it would reach beyond those prison walls. Johnny Cash took that song and gave it wings, and for one night in Anaheim, they came together again and showed 15,000 people what grace looks like when it's real and messy and imperfect. We remember Glen Sherley not for how his life ended, but for the beauty he created in the midst of his pain. We remember that reunion, not because it fixed everything, but because it showed us that human connection matters more than perfect outcomes. Johnny Cash could have ignored Glen that night, could have stayed on the stage and finished his concert, but he didn't. He stopped everything and pulled his brother back into the light, even knowing it might only last for a moment. That's the lesson. We save each other not once, but over and over again, for as long as we have the strength to reach out our hands. And sometimes that salvation looks like a song written in a prison cell. Sometimes it looks like a concert interrupted. Sometimes it looks like 15,000 people witnessing 2 broken men holding on to each other and refusing to let go. The recording of that Anaheim concert still exists. If you listen carefully, you can hear the moment when the crowd realizes what's happening. You can hear the silence, the gasp, the eruption of emotion. You can hear 2 voices, one famous and one forgotten, singing about finding hope in a place called Greystone Chapel. Glen Sherley left this world too soon, carrying burdens too heavy for any one person to bear. But he left behind a song that still echoes through the years, a reminder that our worth isn't determined by our worst mistakes or our greatest struggles. He left behind a moment on a stage in Anaheim when 15,000 people learned what it means to truly see another human being, and Johnny Cash left behind a legacy of using his platform not just for entertainment, but for elevation, for reaching down and pulling people up, for stopping his concert in front of 15,000 people and saying, "This man matters, his story matters, his pain matters." What moment of connection have you witnessed that changed how you see redemption? Share your story in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to hear more stories of humanity breaking through in unexpected moments. Because in the end, we're all just people trying to find our way home. And sometimes, if we're lucky, someone stops everything and sings our song.